The fire had burned out 3 hours before dawn, but inside Matthias Cohen's cabin, the temperature held steady at 48 degrees, while the Montana wilderness outside dropped to -37. 2 miles away, the Patterson family huddled under every blanket they owned, burning their last firewood and slowly freezing to death in a cabin built exactly to frontier standards. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story might just change how you see the world around you. Matthias Cohen stood in the doorway of Werner Bachmann's cabin and felt the heat pouring past him into the January night. Inside, the Bachmann family huddled within 3 feet of a roaring fire that consumed split logs at a rate that would exhaust their winter supply in weeks. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -20 degrees. Inside, despite the massive fire, the cabin felt barely warm enough to prevent frostbite. Werner looked up from the flames, his face haggard from 3 nights of constant fire tending. His wife Sarah held their youngest child wrapped in buffalo robes. Their 2 older children sat pressed against their mother, dressed in every piece of clothing they owned. Matthias had seen this same desperate scene in a dozen cabins over the past 2 winters. Good people, competent builders, solid structures, all slowly losing the battle against the cold. The cabin itself was built correctly by every frontier standard. The logs were thick, 12 inches in diameter, selected for straightness. The corners used proper saddle notching, fitted tightly. Between each log course, Werner had packed clay and moss, chinking, light brown in color, carefully maintained. There were no visible gaps. The door was solid. The window shuttered tight. The floor was packed earth covered with reed mats. In one corner stood a stone fireplace Werner had spent 2 weeks building. The chimney extended well above the roofline. The structure sat elevated 6 inches off the ground on stone footings to prevent moisture rot. By every measure, this cabin should have been adequate. Werner had done everything right, but the roof was killing them. Matthias stepped outside and walked 20 paces from the cabin. The -20-degree air cut through his heavy wool coat. He turned and looked back. In the darkness, he could see the orange glow from the shuttered window. More importantly, he could see the snow. The roof was covered in 3 inches of fresh snow. But in a wide circle around the chimney, perhaps 6 feet across, the snow had melted completely. The exposed bark roofing steamed faintly. Beyond that circle, the snow showed uneven patches where heat bleeding through had created depressions. Matthias understood what it meant. The fire inside was producing enormous heat. That heat was rising and escaping through the thin bark roof almost as fast as Werner could feed the flames. They were heating the Montana wilderness, 1 log at a time. Werner appeared at the door, having followed him outside. "You burn through a cord of wood every week like this?" Matthias asked. "More during real cold snaps. We'll run out before spring." "Your walls are good. Your chinking is solid." "I did everything right," Werner said, exhausted. "Everything my father taught me, but we're still freezing." Matthias looked up at the roof. Bark strips laid over pole rafters, moss underneath for minor insulation. The same design used on 90% of frontier cabins. It kept rain out, it shed snow, and it was worthless for holding heat. This was the winter of 1839 in the Montana Territory. Matthias Cohen and his partner Dirk Halverson had been trapping and settling here for 3 years. They had built their own cabin using the same methods Werner had used. They had survived, but barely. And now, looking at the Bachmann family slowly freezing despite doing everything correctly, Matthias realized something fundamental was wrong with how every settler in this territory built their shelters. The walls didn't matter if the roof let all the heat escape. Matthias returned to his own cabin 3 days later, riding through snow that had deepened to 18 inches in the open meadows. He had been checking trap lines along the eastern tributaries, a circuit that took him 40 miles from home. The weather had been cold but manageable, hovering around -10 degrees during the day, dropping to -15 at night. He had expected to find Dirk Halverson inside their cabin, probably with a fire going and coffee ready. They had been partners for 3 years, splitting the trapping territory and sharing the work of survival. Dirk was reliable, competent, careful. He knew how to manage a fire, ration, firewood, survive alone. But when Matthias opened the cabin door, he found Dirk dead. His partner lay in his bedroll near the cold fireplace, wrapped in every blanket and fur they owned. His face was pale, his lips blue. The cabin interior felt only slightly warmer than the air outside. Matthias stood in the doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. The fireplace held the remains of their entire firewood supply. Dirk had burned through everything, the split logs they had stacked inside, the kindling, even pieces of their supply shelf. The ash pile was enormous. He had fought desperately to stay warm. It had not been enough. Matthias forced himself to move. He checked the cabin for signs of what had happened. No animal attack, no injury, no illness, just cold. He examined the firewood situation more carefully and realized Dirk must have kept the fire roaring continuously, burning logs as fast as he could split them from the emergency supply outside. The thermometer they kept hanging on the wall read 12 degrees inside the cabin, with a fire that had burned until the wood ran out. Matthias stepped outside and saw the evidence, written in the snow. The roof showed massive melt patterns, an enormous circle of bare bark where heat had poured through. The snow around the entire cabin perimeter had melted and refrozen in irregular patterns. Dirk had produced tremendous heat, burned their whole supply, and still frozen to death because the cabin could not hold warmth. Later, Matthias learned what had happened. A cold front had pushed through during his absence. Temperatures had dropped to -42 degrees for 36 hours. It was the kind of cold that killed quickly, the kind that turned moisture in your breath to ice crystals before it hit the ground. Dirk had done everything a competent frontiersman should do. He had built up the fire. He had blocked the door gaps with rags. He had wrapped himself in layers. He had stayed active to generate body heat. He had burned every piece of wood within reach. And he had frozen anyway. Matthias buried his partner on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had set their best trap lines. He piled stones to mark the grave and spoke no words because there were no words adequate. Then he returned to the cabin and sat in the cold darkness, thinking. The frontier had always been dangerous. Men died from bear attacks, accidents, hostile encounters, drowning, falls. Matthias had accepted those risks, but this was different. Dirk had not died from bad luck or poor judgment. He had died because the cabin, built correctly, maintained well, constructed exactly as every frontier guide recommended, could not protect him from cold. Matthias spent the spring of 1839 investigating a question that obsessed him. Why did cabins fail to hold heat? He abandoned his trap lines, left beaver pelts uncollected, and instead traveled throughout the territory, studying how settlers built their shelters and how those shelters performed during winter. He visited 19 cabins within 30 miles of his location. He talked to families who had barely survived the winter, listening carefully to their descriptions of the cold months. A pattern emerged that was both clear and damning. Every family reported the same experience. They burned enormous quantities of firewood. They tended fires constantly, sometimes through entire nights. They wore multiple layers of clothing inside their own homes, and despite all this effort, they remained cold. Children developed frostbite while sleeping. Adults woke with ice formed on their blankets from frozen breath. Interior temperatures dropped to near freezing, even with fires burning. Matthias began conducting simple experiments. He would visit a cabin on a cold day and observe. He watched where snow melted on roofs. He noted frost patterns on walls. He paid attention to how quickly cabins lost heat after fires died down. The results were consistent. Cabins with thick walls and thin roofs lost heat rapidly. Cabins with excellent chinking and bark roofing could not maintain warmth. Even cabins with Stone fireplaces and quality construction failed the fundamental test of keeping people alive in extreme cold. He found 3 abandoned cabins where families had given up and moved away or died. In each case, the walls were solid. The construction was adequate. But the roofs were identical, thin layers of bark or wooden shakes over pole rafters, maybe some moss stuffed underneath for token insulation. Matthias started measuring. Using a simple method of placing snow on interior surfaces and timing how long it took to melt, he estimated heat loss rates. The walls, even with gaps in the chinking, lost relatively little heat. Cold air came in at floor level, but the rate was manageable. The real bleeding happened overhead. He calculated that roughly 70% of a cabin's heat escaped through the roof. The warm air rose, hit the thin barrier of bark and wood, and transferred its heat to the exterior surface where winter wind stripped it away immediately. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. During his travels, Matthias encountered a Norwegian settler named Lars Ostberg, who had built something different, a sod house dug partially into a hillside with thick earth walls and roof. Lars invited him inside during a cold afternoon. The difference was remarkable. No fire burned, yet the interior felt comfortable, perhaps 45 degrees. The thick earth walls and roof held residual heat from the previous day's small fire. Matthias asked questions. Lars explained the principle simply. Earth holds heat. Thick layers insulate. Mass stores warmth and releases it slowly. His people had built this way in Norway for generations. That conversation changed everything. Matthias began formulating a theory. The roof needed mass, not just coverage. It needed insulation depth, not just weather protection. It needed to be built like the earth itself, thick, layered, alive. He decided to test this theory. If it failed, he would die like Dirk. If it worked, he might save lives. Matthias left the Montana Territory in early June of 1839 with his spring furs loaded on 2 pack horses. The journey to St. Louis took 3 weeks, following established trading routes through mountain passes and across prairie that was just beginning to green after the brutal winter. Most trappers made this journey for one reason: to sell their furs, collect their money, and spend it quickly on whiskey, women, and supplies before returning to the mountains. Matthias sold his furs to a trading house on the riverfront for a decent sum, then did something unusual. He began studying buildings. He spent 3 weeks in St. Louis, and not a single night in a tavern. Instead, he walked the streets examining construction. He studied a brick warehouse near the docks, noting how the thick masonry walls maintained cool interior temperatures even during hot June days. He asked the owner about winter performance. The man explained that the same thick walls kept the building warm in winter, requiring minimal heating. The principle was thermal mass. Dense material stored temperature and resisted change. Matthias examined stone foundations, particularly those used for root cellars and ice houses. He spent an afternoon talking with a German immigrant who was building a cellar beneath his house. The builder showed him how 3 feet of earth covering maintained near constant temperature year-round. The soil insulated against both heat and cold. In winter, the earth absorbed warmth from below and held it. In summer, it blocked external heat. He watched carpenters working on a merchant's house, paying attention to how they layered different materials for different purposes. Tar paper for waterproofing, wood planks for structure, plaster for interior finish. Each material served a specific function. The carpenter explained that good construction used multiple layers, each contributing to the whole. Matthias visited a masonry supply yard and learned about lime mortar, clay mixtures, and how different additives changed material properties. He discovered that horsehair mixed into clay prevented cracking as it dried. That sand improved drainage, that certain clays were more waterproof than others. He bought supplies that other trappers would have considered worthless. 6 large rolls of birch bark carefully selected for flexibility and lack of holes. 20 pounds of clay powder meant for mortar work. A bundle of oakum fiber used for sealing ship hulls. 2 specialized draw knives for shaping wood. A hand auger for drilling. Square-cut nails in 3 different sizes. Other mountain men saw his purchases and mocked him openly. One trapper asked if he was planning to build a church. Another suggested he was wasting his fur money on nonsense. Matthias said nothing. He loaded his unusual supplies onto the pack horses and began the journey back to the mountains. During those 3 weeks of riding, he refined his plans. A cabin needed standard walls. No point reinventing what worked adequately. But the roof needed to be revolutionary. It needed birch bark for waterproofing, clay mixture for sealing, and 8 to 12 inches of dense soil topped with living sod. The weight would be enormous. The construction would take months. Other settlers would think him insane. But if his theory was correct, the cabin would hold heat like nothing the frontier had ever seen. Matthias returned to the Montana Territory in late July of 1839 and immediately selected a building site. He chose high ground 50 yards from the creek, a slight rise with clear sight lines and good drainage. Most trappers built near water for convenience. Matthias prioritized other factors. If heavy rains came, he wanted to be above any flooding. If the roof design worked as planned, the structure would last decades, and proper drainage would prevent foundation rot. He began construction in early August. The foundation came first, something most frontier cabins lacked entirely. He dug a shallow trench around the perimeter and filled it with flat stones, creating a level base elevated 6 inches above ground level. This would prevent ground moisture from wicking into the logs and allow air circulation underneath. For the walls, Matthias selected logs carefully. He wanted dark, dense wood with minimal taper. He spent 2 weeks cutting and hauling 42 logs, each roughly 12 inches in diameter and 16 feet long. He stripped the bark completely, then let them season for a week in direct sunlight. The wall construction followed standard methods. He used saddle notch corners, fitting each log carefully but not obsessing over revolutionary joinery. The corners weren't the innovation. He built the walls 7 logs high, creating interior space of approximately 8 feet at the peak. Between each log course, he packed a mixture of clay, sand, and moss fiber, creating light brown chinking that sealed gaps effectively. The walls went up in 2 weeks. Then came the revolutionary part. Matthias engineered the roof to support extraordinary weight. He selected 3 massive logs for ridge poles, each 10 inches in diameter and spanning the cabin's width. These weren't random branches. They were carefully chosen for strength and straightness. He notched them to sit securely on the top wall logs, spacing them 18 inches apart. Across these ridge poles, he laid split planks he had hewn flat on one side. The planks overlapped like shingles, each layer covering gaps in the layer below. He spent a week shaping these planks with his draw knife, creating tight fits that left minimal space. Over the planks came birch bark. He laid it in 3 overlapping layers, each layer offset so no seam aligned with the seam below. The bark was flexible, naturally waterproof, and formed the crucial moisture barrier. Over the bark, Matthias spread his clay mixture. He had experimented with ratios and settled on clay powder, sand, and horsehair fiber, mixed with water to form a thick paste. He applied it carefully, building up a half-inch layer that sealed every potential leak point. The horsehair prevented cracking as the clay dried. Then came the earth. Matthias hauled soil mixed with prairie sod, building up layers until he had achieved 8 to 10 inches of depth across the entire roof. The weight was tremendous. The walls creaked under the load but held. Finally, he laid living grass sod as the top layer. The roots would bind everything together and create natural insulation. The construction took 12 weeks total. Other settlers who saw it called it Cohen's dirt pile and predicted collapse within a month. October of 1839 brought an early cold front that dropped temperatures to -15 degrees for 6 consecutive days. Most settlers considered it a warning of the hard winter to come. For Matthias, it was the first real test of his theory. He had moved into the cabin in late September, spending 2 weeks arranging his supplies and building interior furniture. The stone fireplace he had constructed stood in the northwest corner, its chimney rising 8 feet above the roofline for proper draft. He had built a sleeping platform raised 2 feet off the ground and installed shelves for food storage. On the first night of the cold snap, Matthias lit a moderate fire. Not the roaring blaze that Werner Bachmann maintained constantly, but a controlled burn using split logs about 4 inches in diameter. He fed the fire for approximately 4 hours in the evening, letting it burn down to coals around 10 o'clock. Then he let it die completely. This was the test. In a standard cabin, the interior temperature would plummet within an hour of the fire going out. By dawn, it would be near freezing inside. Matthias had purchased a mercury thermometer in St. Louis specifically for this experiment. He hung it on the wall opposite the fireplace and monitored it throughout the night. At 10 o'clock, when the fire died to coals, the interior temperature read 56 degrees. At midnight, 53 degrees. At 2 in the morning, 50 degrees. At dawn, 47 degrees. The cabin had lost only 9 degrees over 8 hours with no fire burning. Outside, the temperature was -15. Matthias stepped outside in the morning light and examined the structure. Snow had fallen during the night, covering the roof with 2 inches of fresh powder. Around the chimney, a small circle, perhaps 2 feet in diameter, showed melted snow from residual heat in the stones. Beyond that circle, the snow remained intact, except for subtle variations where the warmest sections of roof had caused minor melting. Most significantly, the snow around the cabin's perimeter had melted in a narrow band about 2 to 3 feet wide. This indicated controlled heat radiation through the walls and foundation. The cabin was releasing warmth, but slowly, in a manageable pattern that suggested excellent heat retention. He went back inside and lit another moderate fire. Within an hour, the interior temperature climbed back to 56 degrees. He let this fire burn for 3 hours, then allowed it to die again. The pattern repeated. The thick sod roof absorbed heat during the burning period and released it slowly over the following 12 to 16 hours. Over the 6-day cold period, Matthias burned approximately 1/5 the firewood a standard cabin would have required. He slept comfortably without excessive blankets. He worked inside without wearing his heavy coat. The interior remained consistently between 45 and 55 degrees with minimal effort. When the temperature rose back to 10 degrees and other settlers emerged from their cabins exhausted from constant fire tending, they noticed Matthias's chimney had barely smoked. Some asked questions. Most remained skeptical. It was only -15, they said, not truly dangerous. Cold. The real test would come when winter arrived in full force. January of 1840 brought the worst cold snap the Montana Territory had experienced in 15 years. The temperature dropped to -37 degrees on the 9th of January and remained at or below -35 for 11 consecutive days. Standard cabins became desperate survival situations. Families burned furniture when firewood supplies ran low. The Patterson family, living 4 miles south of Matthias, froze to death in their sleep despite having a fire burning. The father had fallen asleep while tending the flames. The fire died. The cabin temperature dropped to 0 within 2 hours. By morning, all 5 family members were dead. The Johnsons, a family of 6 living 3 miles east, survived only by abandoning their cabin and moving into their small underground root cellar. They spent 9 days huddled in the tiny space, burning minimal fuel, staying alive because the earth around them provided insulation their cabin could not. Peter Drummond lived closest to Matthias, approximately 2 miles northwest. He had 3 children, ages 4, 7, and 9. His cabin was well built with thick walls and quality chinking, but like every other standard cabin, it had a thin bark roof. On the 5th day of the extreme cold, his youngest child developed frostbite on her feet, despite wearing wool socks and sleeping wrapped in furs next to the fire. Peter's wife wrapped the child's feet in warm cloths and kept her as close to the flames as safely possible, but the frostbite worsened. On the 6th day, Peter made the dangerous decision to travel to Matthias's cabin for help. He wrapped his daughter in every blanket they could spare and made the 2-mile journey on foot, carrying the child. The journey in minus 36-degree temperature could have killed them both, but Peter was desperate, and he had heard rumors about Matthias's unusual cabin. He arrived at midday and found something that seemed impossible. Smoke rose from Matthias's chimney in a thin, steady stream, not the thick, constant plume of a cabin fighting for survival. Through the window, Peter could see the warm glow of interior light. Matthias opened the door, and Peter felt heat roll out into the frozen air. Inside, the cabin was comfortably warm. Not hot like the Bachman cabin had been during Matthias's visit the previous year, but genuinely warm, stable, the kind of warmth that allowed a person to remove their outer coat and work in shirt sleeves. Matthias's thermometer read 48 degrees. Peter stood in the doorway, his daughter in his arms, and could not comprehend what he was experiencing. His own cabin, with a fire that consumed wood constantly, barely maintained temperatures above freezing. This cabin, with a moderate fire that Matthias tended twice daily, was warmer than any frontier dwelling Peter had ever entered during winter. "How?" Peter asked. Matthias looked at the child's frostbitten feet, then at Peter's exhausted face. "The roof," he said simply. "Everything else is the same, just the roof." He invited them inside, treated the child's frostbite with warm water and clean cloths, and explained the principle while Peter held his daughter near the fire. Thermal mass, insulation, heat retention. The earth itself, holding warmth like a stone, holds the sun's heat long after sunset. Peter Drummond and his daughter spent 2 days in Matthias's cabin while the extreme cold continued outside. During those 2 days, Peter experienced something that changed his understanding of frontier survival. The cabin remained consistently warm, with minimal firewood consumption. Matthias tended the fire twice daily, burning moderate amounts for 3 to 4 hours each session. Between fires, the temperature dropped only a few degrees over 8 to 10 hours. When the cold snap finally broke on the 20th of January, and temperatures rose to a manageable minus 10 degrees, Peter returned home with his daughter. The contrast was immediate and brutal. His own cabin, even with a roaring fire, felt cold and drafty compared to the stable warmth he had experienced. His remaining firewood supply was nearly exhausted from 11 days of desperate burning. Spring came in April of 1840. The Patterson family's frozen bodies were discovered and buried. Other families who had survived emerged with stories of near-death experiences, lost fingers and toes to frostbite, and wood supplies completely exhausted. 3 other families in the broader region had lost members to the cold. Word spread about Matthias's cabin surviving the extreme temperatures with minimal firewood use. Settlers began visiting, asking questions. How thick was the roof? What materials did he use? How did the construction work? Matthias shared his technique freely. He had no interest in keeping secrets or profiting from knowledge. He was interested in survival. If others could build cabins that kept their families alive, that was sufficient reward. Peter Drummond asked for help building a sod-roof cabin that summer. Matthias agreed. They worked together for 10 weeks, following the same process Matthias had developed. Standard wall construction, with saddle-notch corners and quality chinking. Elevated foundation for drainage, dark, dense logs, carefully selected and fitted. Then the revolutionary roof. Birch bark waterproofing, clay seal, 8 to 10 inches of soil and sod, living grass layer on top. Klaus Ashford, a settler who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite during the cold snap, built the third sod roof cabin that same summer. He followed Matthias's principles but made minor adjustments based on available materials. He used additional clay in his ceiling mixture and increased the soil depth to 12 inches. His cabin, completed in September, showed similar thermal performance when tested during the first cold weather of autumn. By winter of 1841, 7 cabins in the Montana Territory region had sod roofs. The families living in these structures represented roughly 30 people, including 16 children. That winter brought another severe cold period. Temperatures dropped to -28 degrees for 3 weeks in February. Standard cabins suffered the familiar desperate struggle: constant fires, massive wood consumption, cold interiors, and risk of death. The 7 sod roof cabins maintained comfortable temperatures with normal firewood use. 0 deaths occurred in sod roof cabins that winter. 3 deaths occurred in standard cabins, all from exposure-related causes during the cold period. The comparison became undeniable. Settlers began calling them warm cabins or grass roof cabins to distinguish them from standard construction. The terminology spread as the technique itself spread, moving beyond the immediate region into broader frontier territories. Between 1841 and 1845, sod roof construction spread across the northern frontier territories. As more settlers adopted the technique, practical refinements emerged through collective experience and problem-solving. Some builders discovered that roof pitch mattered significantly. Matthias's original design used a moderate slope that worked adequately for snow shedding. Klaus Ashford experimented with a steeper pitch and found that heavy snow loads slid off more readily, reducing structural stress during harsh winters. His modification became the preferred approach for regions expecting heavy snowfall. Others addressed moisture control issues. Living sod roofs absorbed rain and snowmelt, which generally benefited the insulation properties. But in extremely wet conditions, excess moisture could lead to interior dripping. A settler named Gustav Brandt added a ventilation gap between the birch bark layer and the soil, allowing air circulation that carried away excess moisture while maintaining insulation properties. This refinement eliminated the rare occurrence of interior dampness. Matthias himself discovered an unexpected long-term benefit. After 3 years, the living grass roots on his cabin had grown extensively, creating a dense mat that bound the soil layers together. This root system prevented erosion far better than he had anticipated, and actually improved insulation over time by creating natural air pockets throughout the soil mass. The biological component of the roof was not merely cosmetic, it was functionally beneficial. The technique spread beyond Montana into Dakota Territory and Wyoming as settlers moved west and shared knowledge. Homesteaders arriving in new territories sought out experienced builders who knew the sod roof method. Some abandoned cabins built with the technique were discovered by new settlers and immediately recognized as superior construction. These structures were occupied and maintained, sometimes serving continuously for 20 to 30 years. The practical advantages extended beyond winter heat retention. During summer months, the thermal mass worked in reverse. The thick roof stayed cool, preventing interior temperatures from rising excessively during hot weather. The cabins maintained more stable year-round temperatures than standard construction, making them comfortable in all seasons. Fire resistance improved dramatically. External sparks from forest fires or lightning strikes could not ignite a sod roof. Several instances were recorded of grass fires passing near sod roof cabins without causing structural damage, while standard cabins with wooden shake roofs were completely destroyed. Sound insulation was notably better. The thick earth layer dampened exterior noise from wind, rain, and wildlife. Families reported sleeping more soundly, undisturbed by weather sounds that penetrated thin bark roofs. Structural longevity exceeded expectations. Standard cabins typically required major repairs or rebuilding after 5 to 7 years due to roof deterioration and wall settling. Sod roof cabins remained structurally sound for decades because the stable interior temperatures reduced wood expansion and contraction cycles that caused joint failure and log cracking. By 1845, historians estimate between 40 and 50 cabins across the northern frontier used sod roof construction. The exact number is uncertain because many were built in remote locations and went unrecorded. But the technique had established itself as a proven alternative to standard methods. Settlers who experienced both construction types universally preferred the sod roof design despite the additional building time required. The investment of 12 weeks instead of 4 days proved worthwhile when measured against survival, comfort, and structural longevity. Matthias Cohen left the Montana Territory in the spring of 1847. The Rocky Mountain fur trade had collapsed completely by that time. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction across most ranges. More significantly, fashion had changed in eastern cities and Europe. Silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying the market that had driven the entire mountain man era. Trappers and settlers who had built lives in the wilderness faced a choice: stay and find new livelihoods or move on. Matthias chose to move. He had saved money during his years trapping, living frugally and banking profits from good seasons. He used those savings to purchase land in the Oregon Territory, a small plot near the Willamette Valley, where soil was rich and rainfall adequate for farming. He established a modest farm, raising wheat and vegetables. In 1848, he married Annalise, a widow from a wagon train who had lost her husband to cholera during the journey west. She had 2 young children from her first marriage. Matthias and Annalise had 3 children together over the following years. He lived quietly. He farmed, competently but without particular distinction. He was known in his community as reliable, helpful to neighbors, and unusually skilled at building. He constructed several barns and outbuildings for nearby farms, always with careful attention to structural integrity and weather resistance. He never wrote about his cabin innovation, never sought recognition, or attempted to profit from the technique he had developed. To his family and neighbors in Oregon, he was simply a former trapper who had become a farmer. His children knew nothing of the Montana winters or the sod roof cabins that had saved lives. Matthias Cohen died in 1869 at the age of 63. He passed quietly in his sleep, surrounded by family. His gravestone in the small cemetery outside Salem, Oregon, recorded his name, birth and death years, and the words beloved husband and father. Nothing more. But in Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakota territories, the cabins remained. Some were still inhabited by the families who had built them, or by new settlers who recognized superior construction when they found it. Others served as way stations for travelers, offering reliable shelter in harsh conditions. A few stood abandoned but intact, weathering decades because they had been built to last. The phrase, "built warm like a cone cabin," entered frontier vocabulary as shorthand for quality construction that prioritized function over speed. Settlers into the 1870s and beyond continued using variations of the sod roof technique, adapting it to local materials and conditions, but maintaining the core principles Matthias had established. Modern historians researching frontier survival patterns estimate that several dozen lives were saved over 2 decades because settlers built cabins capable of retaining heat during extreme cold. The exact number cannot be determined because survival often went unrecorded, but the impact was real, measured in children who did not freeze, families who survived winters intact, and communities that endured where others had failed. Matthias Cohen's legacy was not carved in monuments or written in books. It was built into logs and earth, standing silent across the northern frontier as testament to what careful observation and engineering could accomplish when necessity demanded innovation.